Hello, my name is Debbie. I'm a second year THD student at Duke Divinity. It's currently midnight in Singapore where I'm recording this, and it's great to be able to conference virtually with all of you from around the world. I think that's one of the ways the pandemic has really expanded our reach. And in the same vein, in my presentation today, I want to reflect on how liturgy in a pandemic can lead us to expand our conception of liturgy. There's obviously much more than can be said in these 15 to 20 minutes, but I hope to raise some questions and get us thinking about what the pandemic might teach us about worship, even for the life beyond it, a life which I'm sure we're all longing for. So to get started, I want to bring up an anecdote from one of my favorite TV shows, the BBC television adaptation of Sherlock Holmes, starring Benedict Cumberbatch. In season 2, episode 1, we find our detective hero in the living room of his nemesis, Irene Adler, and he's trying to discover the location of her concealed safe. So she's there, and she and Holmes engage in some, polite British smack talk until Sherlock employs a simple trick to uncover the safe's hidden hiding spot. He asks his accomplice, John Watson, to set off the fire alarm. And as soon as the alarm goes off, Adler's eyes flicker toward the mirror behind which the safe is hidden. And thus she reveals, its location. Sherlock explains why this trick works, saying that fire exposes our priorities. Our instinct in a fire is to save the thing that we treasure the most. And similarly, the way that churches have responded to the global pandemic reveals what they consider to be their central mission. And it's that response that I want to examine today. Analyzing the results of a two-part survey of over 1,500 pastors and leaders conducted in March and April of 2020, Professor Heidi Campbell observes that pastors overwhelmingly ranked conducting weekend services as their priority, whether that meant moving services online or just insisting on meeting in person despite regulations and recommendations to the contrary. Campbell, who studies digital religion and new media, observes that this response reveals a primarily event-based understanding of religion that she argues is out of step with the networked age in which we live, one in which people experience community as a social network of relations, rather than centered around a single group such as the church. In our brief time together today, I want to suggest that this dichotomy between an event-based and a networked approach to religious community is a false one. And that the Christian community has always been a networked community. Campbell is right to suggest that a Christian community which understands itself solely or primarily in terms of its ability to gather together is missing a crucial element. However, the very telos of the worship gathering is the sending of people into the vast networks of which they are a part, and the networks in which they are encouraged to participate fully as disciples of Christ. And so what we need, I argue, is not a decentering of the worship event from church community, but rather a reclaiming of the event more fully as one that is concerned with creating and sustaining a community that is both local and global, both situated and dispersed, both gathered and sent. So let's begin briefly by exploring the claims made about networked religion and society. The idea of a networked society has been around at least since 1991 with the publication of Jan van Dijk's book, The Networked Society. And this idea has only increased in popularity in the years since, especially with what Lee Rainey and Barry Wellman referred to in 2010 as the triple revolution of the internet, social media, and mobile. Among the features of what Rainey and Wellman call this new social operating system are a move away from group or institutional identity towards networked individualism and a corresponding shift of authority structures. Whereas in the past, people's social networks used to be small and revolved tightly around family and community groups, they are now looser and more expansive. Where social relationships were once centered on these tightly knit groups, now each individual is the center of their own social network. And with this shift comes a blurring of authority as traditional hierarchies are diluted by the horizontal connections enabled by this social network. The internet has made information that was once restricted to those with special expertise and training available to anyone with a smartphone or a computer who can spell Google or Wikipedia. Local pastors, similarly, are no longer the only or even the closest spiritual authority to which individuals have access. Now, the shift in structure has been seen by some as a threat to the social fabric of society. In 1970, Robert Putnam identified this shift away from group-based membership as a sign of the collapse of American community. And pastors and leaders of churches likewise fear that the declining attendance that they see in their church services is a sign of decreased religiosity among their members. This focus on numbers in attendance is one of the negative outcomes that Campbell names of this event-based approach to religious community. The assumption is that if people aren't attending church, they aren't coming to worship, then they aren't engaging with and they aren't committed to the faith. So participation in the worship event is seen as the marker of one's religiosity and faithfulness. This sort of event-based approach leads many pastors to, double down their efforts to make church services more engaging so that more people will come. But meanwhile, a recognition of our networked reality has led others to adopt a different strategy. Instead of trying to bring people to church, they focus on bringing the church to where people already are. In his book, The Digital Cathedral, Networked Ministry in a Wireless World, Keith Anderson tells of ministry initiatives that range from theology pub gatherings to Bible studies held in coffee shops to simply handing out coffee and donuts on a street corner as examples of a networked, relational, and incarnational approach to ministry leadership for a digital age. Anderson's vision is for, quote, a more expansive understanding of church and ways of being church at a time when our definitions of church have become all too narrow, too parochial, end quote, too event-based, we might say. Anderson urges church leaders to step out of the church and to be present in the places where people work, live, and play, and to pay attention to the spirituality of everyday life, distinct from the formal spirituality of the institutional church. Now, this attention to the spirituality of everyday life represents what Jean Halgren-Kild describes as a situational approach to sacred space. This is an approach in which sacred space is constructed by the actions and meanings that humans assign to it. And this is in contrast to a substantive approach, which limits sacred space to designated so-called religious places like churches. The situational approach, which is represented by Anderson's model, expands the religious community beyond the church building by choosing to recognize ordinary places as sacred as well. In this way, it acknowledges the networked relationality according to which the world operates, which Campbell says how it operates. And it seeks to be present in those networks beyond the church, thereby decentering the traditional hierarchical structure that centers religious community within the church's walls and specifically within the worship event. Such an approach creates the space to acknowledge that there are other ways to engage faithfully in religious community outside of participation in the worship event. But this raises a key ecclesiological question for us. Are all of these events the same? Are situational and substantive approaches to religious community interchangeable? Does the situational networked approach replace the substantive event-based one? Are theology pub gatherings an adequate substitute for participation in the liturgy like we do traditionally? Or is there something about this formal liturgical event that still warrants a central place in church's understanding of religious community? Another way of framing that question is to ask whether it's enough simply that we gather, or if how we gather and what we do when we gather also matters. Now, liturgical theologians such as Aidan Kavanagh and David Fagerberg insist that the liturgical gathering is a special kind of gathering. It's distinct from other gatherings that might also be convened in the name of God. They emphasize that it is God who gathers us and God who gives the liturgy, that the rites and rituals of the liturgy, and they have in mind largely baptism and communion, that these are how God has chosen to reveal God's self to us. Humans don't make the liturgy. We don't convene this gathering. We receive the liturgy. And as we receive and participate in it, we are formed and transformed with the capacity to see God at work in the world more clearly. The liturgy also makes demands upon us. In what has come to be understood as the traditional fourfold pattern, the event does not end with us simply leaving the sanctuary because it's over. We are sent out. We are commissioned to continue the reconciling work of God that we've just encountered in the liturgy out in the world. And this sending is very much a part of the event. So in this understanding, the worship event is in fact what enables us to see the sacred in everyday life and in the networks of which we are a part. It's what enables us and causes us to go out then and to carry on this work in the world. And in that way, both event and network are bound up together in the liturgical event. We might say in some ways that the liturgical event acts as a center from which we are sent out to be the church, but we must not fall prey to what Paul Homer terms liturgical hyperconsciousness, being overly conscious of the liturgy itself, when in fact the aim of the liturgy is to make one conscious of God. It is God who gathers, it is God who sends, and it is the same God who the liturgy leads us to worship at all times and in all places. And so if the worship event is seen as an end in itself, then its telos remains unfulfilled. We need to be sent out in order for the worship event to be doing what it's supposed to do. So whereas an event-based approach of the kind that Campbell criticizes takes as its goal, oftentimes, the increase in the number of people who participate in this event, I'd suggest that a properly balanced approach that recognizes the proper telos of the event to be the commissioning of its participants to be for the world the body of Christ should have as one of its main goals the equipping of those people who are being sent forth. What does all of this mean for liturgy in the midst of a pandemic? First, I think it does affirm the instinct of those pastors and leaders who focused on trying to maintain a worship gathering. At the same time, however, it reminds us that the goal of these offerings is not simply to reach a certain level of viewership or attendance. Many pastors lament their lower viewership for online services as compared to in-person attendees, and they fear that their congregants are no longer engaging in religious community. This fear is a valid one, but Campbell's critique reminds us that viewership numbers might not be the best metric to focus on, both in terms of accuracy and mission. Anecdotal evidence suggests that while some have indeed stopped going to church during this time and have not engaged in any alternative forms of religious activity, many others have actually found new ways of worshiping through practices of morning prayer, evening prayer, liturgies that are written for the ordinary events of daily life, and various online religious communities that they find on social media. And so the conclusion that congregants who are not attending services online have forsaken worship practices altogether might not be entirely true. Even in cases where it is true, I think what should trouble pastors most is not the fact that they're not attending church, but that these congregants' previous participation in worship somehow has failed to form them to be a people whose worship can continue even beyond and in the absence of the worship event. This should be a concern even during non-pandemic times, but just as the pandemic exposed our priorities, it also exposes our vulnerabilities and draws our attention to areas that might otherwise have been neglected. The role of the liturgy has not changed, but in the wake of COVID-19, online church, and incredible Zoom fatigue, some churches might find that they have been guilty of a kind of liturgical hyperconsciousness. And so a crucial question that the pandemic should be leading church leaders to ask, I think, is not only how do we do this better, how do we move our services online and keep people engaged, but how do we teach and encourage parishioners to pay attention to the spirituality of everyday life, so that even in the absence of regular weekly gatherings, they might continue to recall the life, death, and resurrection of Christ and to live accordingly as faithful disciples of Jesus. Another way to put that is, how do we help them to understand the mission with which they are sent forth from the worship event into the world, especially in a time when the world into which they are sent forth is one that is largely confined to the walls of their home? How is the way that we conduct the liturgy forming or failing to form in parishioners the capacity to approach sacred space situationally, to see in every place, person, and ritual the possibility of encounter with the living God? What resources are we providing or failing to provide parishioners with in order to equip them to develop this capacity outside of the worship event throughout the rest of the week and their lives? An event-based approach to worship positions the liturgical event as the be-all and end-all of Christian worship and discipleship. In some ways, it restricts the liturgy to the event, to the liturgy with a capital L, as though the liturgy itself has been locked down, prevented from leaving the walls of the worship hall or sanctuary. Such an approach naturally results in liturgical hyperconsciousness. It directs participants to fixate on the liturgy instead of the God to whom it points. Fagerberg suggests that instead of looking at the liturgy, we should be looking through it. And far from being an end in itself, the liturgy should actually serve as a lens through which we are able to see the world as being shot through with the presence of God. Rather than keeping us captive to itself, the liturgy, as the work of God, frees us to discern the light of Christ and the work of the Spirit more fully in the world, enabling us to embrace the sacramentality of everyday life. So although many of us are still able, thanks to the advent of technology, to worship together in some form, the pandemic, I think, has invited us to consider a situation in which that might not be possible at all. And that was, in fact, the case for many before the pandemic who were hindered from coming to church by illness or disability or whatever other cause. And even now, for many who don't have the technology or the skills required to join these online gatherings. And so if participation in the weekly worship event is considered necessary in order to be faithful disciples, then many people are automatically excluded from that. If, however, we affirm that the centrality of the worship event consists primarily in its rehearsal of the gospel story, that the event is not an end in itself, then I think we can shift our attention to start asking what we are doing to equip and to encourage those who can't attend the event to continue the worship that is begun by Christ's offering in the liturgy. More and more resources are emerging like these on the screen, which aim to do just that, to equip people to learn to worship outside of church, outside of the event. But I think there's a lot more room for theological reflection on how we understand the relationship between our life together and our life apart. The pandemic has shaken the foundations of our worship life in many ways, but rather than restricting our worship, I think it invites us to a more expansive vision of worship that begins at the liturgy, but continues far beyond it, inviting us to encounter God everywhere, even in the midst of a global pandemic. Thank you.